Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. The Secret Doctrine. A digression. With this shloka ends that portion of the stanzas relating to the cosmogony of the universe after the last Mahapralaya, or universal dissolution, which, when it comes, sweeps out of space every differentiated thing, gods as well as atoms, like so many dry leaves. From this verse onwards, the stanzas are only concerned with our solar system in general, with the planetary chains therein inferentially, and with the history of our globe, the fourth and its chain, especially. All the verses which follow in this volume refer only to the evolution of, and on, our Earth. With regard to the latter, a strange tenet, strange from the modern scientific standpoint only, of course is held, which ought to be made known. But before entirely new and somewhat startling theories are presented to the reader, they must be prefaced by a few words of explanation. This is absolutely necessary, as these theories clash not only with modern science, but, on certain points, contradict earlier statements made by other theosophists, who claim to base their explanations and renderings of these teachings on the same authority as we do. This may give rise to the idea that there is a decided contradiction between the expounders of the same doctrine, whereas the difference, in reality, arises from the incompleteness of the information given to earlier writers, who thus drew some erroneous conclusions and indulged in premature speculations in their endeavor to present a complete system to the public. Thus the reader, who is already a student of theosophy, must not be surprised to find in these pages the rectification of certain statements made in various theosophical works, and also the explanation of certain points which have remained obscure because they were necessarily left incomplete. Many are the questions upon which even the author of Esoteric Buddhism, the best and most accurate of all such works, has not touched. On the other hand, even he has introduced several mistaken notions, which must now be presented in their true mystic light, as far as the present writer is capable of so doing. Let us then make a short break between the shlokas just explained and those which follow, for the cosmic periods which separate them are of immense duration. This will afford us ample time to take a bird's-eye view of some points pertaining to the secret doctrine, which have been presented to the public under a more or less uncertain and sometimes mistaken light. A few early misconceptions concerning planets, rounds, and man. Among the 11 stanzas omitted, there is one which gives a full description of the formation of the planetary chains one after another, after the first cosmic and atomic differentiation had commenced in the primitive acosmism. It is idle to speak of laws arising when deity prepares to create, for laws, or rather law, are eternal and uncreated, and again deity is law, and vice versa. Moreover, the one eternal law unfolds everything in the to-be manifested nature on a sevenfold principle, among the rest, the countless circular chains of worlds, composed of 7 globes, graduated on the 4 lower planes of the world of formation, the 3 others belonging to the archetypal universe. Out of these 7 only one, the lowest and the most material of these globes, is within our plane or means of perception, the 6 others lying outside it, and being therefore invisible to the terrestrial eye. Every such chain of worlds is the progeny and creation of another, lower, and dead chain, its reincarnation, so to say. To make it clearer, we are told that each of the planets, of which 7 only were called sacred, as being ruled by the highest regents or gods, and not at all because the ancients knew nothing of the others whether known or unknown, is a septenary, as also is the chain to which the earth belongs. For instance, all such planets as Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, etc., etc., or our Earth, are as visible to us as our globe, probably, is to the inhabitants, if any, of the other planets, because they are all on the same plane, while the superior fellow globes of these planets are on other planes quite outside that of our terrestrial senses. As their relative positions are given further on, and also in the diagram appended to the comments on Shloka 6 of stanza Vi, a few words of explanation is all that is needed at present. These invisible companions correspond curiously to that which we call the principles in man. The seven are on 3 material planes and 1 spiritual plane, answering to the 3 upadhyas, material bases, and 1 spiritual vehicle, vahana, of our 7 principles in the human division. If, for the sake of a clearer mental conception, we imagine the human principles to be arranged as in the following scheme, we shall obtain the following diagram of correspondences. As we are proceeding here from universals to particulars, instead of using the inductive or Aristotelian method, the numbers are reversed. Spirit is enumerated the first instead of 7th, as is usually done, but in truth, ought not to be done. The principles, as usually named after the manner of esoteric Buddhism. The dark horizontal lines of the lower planes are the upadhyas in the case of the human principles, and the planes in the case of the planetary chain. Of course, as regards the human principles, the diagram does not place them quite in order, yet it shows the correspondence and analogy to which attention is now drawn. As the reader will see, it is a case of descent into matter, the adjustment in both the mystic and the physical sense of the two, and their interblending for the great coming struggle for life that awaits both entities. Entity may be thought a strange term to use in the case of a globe, but the ancient philosophers, who saw in the earth a huge animal, were wiser in their generation than our modern geologists are in theirs, and Pliny, who called the earth our kind nurse and mother, the only element which is not inimical to man, spoke more truly than Watts, who fancied that he saw in her the footstool of God. For earth is only the footstool of man in his ascension to higher regions, the vestibule to glorious mansions, through which a moving crowd forever press. But this only shows how admirably occult philosophy fits everything in nature, and how much more logical are its tenets than the lifeless hypothetical speculations of physical science. Having learned thus much, the mystic will be better prepared to understand the occult teaching, though every formal student of modern science may, and probably will, regard it as preposterous nonsense. The student of occultism, however, holds that the theory at present under discussion is far more philosophical and probable than any other. It is more logical, at any rate, than the theory recently advanced which made of the moon the projection of a portion of our Earth, extruded when the latter was a globe in fusion, a molten plastic mass. Says Mr. Samuel Lang, the author of Modern Science and Modern Thought. The astronomical conclusions are theories based on data so uncertain that while in some cases they give results incredibly short, like that of 15 millions of years for the whole past process of formation of the solar system, in others they give 225 results almost incredibly long, as in that which supposes the moon to have been thrown off when the Earth was rotating in 3 hours. While the utmost actual retardation obtained from observation would require 600 millions of years to make it rotate in 23 hours instead of 24. And if physicists persist in such speculations, why should the chronology of the Hindus be laughed at as exaggerated? It is said, moreover, that the planetary chains having their days and their nights, periods of activity or life, and of inertia or death behave in heaven, as do men on earth. They generate their likes, grow old, and become personally extinct, their spiritual principles only living in their progeny as a survival of themselves. Without attempting the very difficult task of giving out the whole process in all its cosmic details, enough may be said to give an approximate idea of it. When a planetary chain is in its last round, its globe, before finally dying out, sends all its energy and principles into a neutral center of latent force, a Laya center, and thereby informs a new nucleus of undifferentiated substance or matter, i.e., calls it into activity or gives it life. Suppose such a process to have taken place in the lunar planetary chain. Suppose again, for argument's sake, though Mr. Darwin's theory quoted below has lately been upset, even if the fact has not yet been ascertained by mathematical calculation that the moon is far older than the Earth. Imagine the 6 fellow globes of the moon eons before the first globe of our 7 was evolved just in the same position in relation to each other as the fellow globes of our chain now occupy in regard to our Earth. And now it will be easy to imagine further globae of the lunar chain, informing globae of the terrestrial chain, and dying. Next globe B of the former sending its energy into globe B of the new chain, then globe C of the lunar, creating its progeny sphere C of the terrene chain, then the moon, our satellite, pouring forth into the lowest globe of our planetary chain globe D, our Earth all its life, energy and powers, and, having transferred them to a new center, becoming virtually a dead planet, in which since the birth of our globe rotation has almost ceased. The moon is the satellite of our Earth, undeniably, but this does not invalidate the theory that she has given to the Earth all but her corpse. For Darwin's theory to hold good, besides the hypothesis just upset, other still more incongruous speculations had to be invented. The moon, it is said, has cooled nearly 6 times as rapidly as the Earth. The moon, if the Earth is 14 million years old since its incrustation, is only 11 2/3 millions of years old since that stage, etc. And if our moon is but a splash from our Earth, why can no similar inference be established for the moons of other planets? The astronomers do not know. Why should Venus and Mercury have no satellites, and by what, when they exist, were they formed? The astronomers do not know, because, we say, science has only one key, the key of matter, to open the mysteries of nature, while occult philosophy has 7 keys and explains that which science fails to see. Mercury and Venus have no satellites, but they had parents just as the Earth had. Both are far older than the Earth, and, before the latter reaches her 7th round, her mother moon will have dissolved into thin air, as the moons of the other planets have, or have not, as the case may be, since there are planets which have several moons, a mystery again which no Oedipus of astronomy has solved. The moon is now the cold residual quantity, the shadow dragged after the new body, into which her living powers and principles are transfused. She now is doomed for long ages to be ever pursuing the Earth, to be attracted by and to attract her progeny. Constantly vampirized by her child, she revenges herself on it, by soaking it through and through with the nefarious, invisible and poisoned influence which emanates from the occult side of her nature. For she is a dead, yet a living body. The particles of her decaying corpse are full of active and destructive life, although the body which they had formed is soulless and lifeless. Therefore its emanations are at the same time beneficent and maleficent as circumstance, finding its parallel on earth in the fact that the grass and plants are nowhere more juicy and thriving than on graves, while at the same time it is the graveyard or corpse emanations which kill. And like all ghouls or vampires, the moon is the friend of the sorcerers and the foe of the unwary. From the archaic eons and the later times of the witches of Thessaly, down to some of the present tantrikas of Bengal, her nature and properties have been known to every occultist, but have remained a closed book for physicists. Such is the moon from the astronomical, geological, and physical standpoints. As to her metaphysical and psychic nature, it must remain an occult secret in this work, as it was in the volume entitled Esoteric Buddhism, notwithstanding the rather sanguine statement made therein that there is not much mystery left now in the riddle of the eighth sphere. These are topics, indeed, on which the adepts are very reserved in their communications to uninitiated pupils, and since they have, moreover, never sanctioned or permitted any published speculations upon them, the less said the better. Yet, without treading upon the forbidden ground of the eighth sphere, it may be useful to state some additional facts with regard to the ex-monads of the lunar chain, the lunar ancestors, as they play a leading part in the coming anthropogenesis. This brings us directly to the septenary constitution of man, and as some discussion has arisen of late about the best classification to be adopted for the division of the microcosmic entity, two systems are now appended with a view to facilitate comparison. The subjoined short article is from the pen of Mr. T. Subbaro, a learned Vedantin scholar. He prefers the Brahmanical division of the Raja Yoga, and from a metaphysical point of view he is quite right. But, as it is a question of simple choice and expediency, we hold in this work to the time-honored classification of the Trans-Himalayan Arhat esoteric school. The following table and its explanatory text are reprinted from the Theosophist and are also contained in 5 years of Theosophy. From the foregoing table it will be seen that the third principle in the Buddhist classification is not separately mentioned in the Vedantic division, as it is merely the vehicle of prana. It will also be seen that the fourth principle is included in the third kasha, sheath, as the same principle is but the vehicle of willpower, which is but an energy of the mind. It must also be noticed that the Vijnanamaya kasha is considered to be distinct from the Manamaya kasha, as a division is made after death between the lower part of the mind, as it were, which has a closer affinity with the fourth principle than with the sixth, and its higher part, which attaches itself to the latter, and which is, in fact, the basis for the higher spiritual individuality of man. We may also here point out to our readers that the classification mentioned in the last column is, for all practical purposes, connected with Raja Yoga, the best and simplest. Though there are 7 principles in man, there are but 3 distinct upadhyas, bases, in each of which his Atma may work independently of the rest. These 3 upadhyas can be separated by an adept without killing himself. He cannot separate the 7 principles from each other without destroying his constitution. The student will now be better prepared to see that between the 3 upadhyas of the Raja Yoga and its Atma, and our 3 upadhyas, Atma, and the additional 3 divisions, there is in reality but very little difference. Moreover, as every adept in cis-Himalayan or trans-Himalayan India, of the Patanjali, the Arya Sangha or the Mahayana schools, has to become a Raja Yogi, he must, therefore, accept the Taraka Raja classification in principle and theory, whatever classification he resorts to for practical and occult purposes. Thus, it matters very little whether one speaks of the three upadhyas, with their three aspects, Anatma, the eternal and immortal synthesis, or calls them the seven principles. For the benefit of those who may not have read, or, if they have, may not have clearly understood, in theosophical writings, the doctrine of the septenary chains of worlds in the solar cosmos, the teaching is briefly as follows. 1. Everything in the metaphysical as in the physical universe is septenary. Hence every sidereal body, every planet, whether visible or invisible, is credited with 6 companion globes. The evolution of life proceeds on these 7 globes or bodies, from the first to the 7th, in 7 rounds or 7 cycles. 2. These globes are formed by a process which the occultists call the rebirth of planetary chains, or rings. When the 7th and last round of one of such rings has been entered upon, the highest or first globe, A, followed by all the others down to the last, instead of entering upon a certain time of rest or obscuration, as in the previous rounds, begins to die out. The planetary dissolution, pralaya, is at hand, and its hour has struck. Each globe has to transfer its life and energy to another planet. 3. Our Earth, as the visible representative of its invisible superior fellow globes, its lords or principles, has to live, as have the others, through 7 rounds. During the first 3, it forms and consolidates. During the 4th, it settles and hardens. During the last 3, it gradually returns to its first ethereal form. It is spiritualized, so to say. 4. Its humanity develops fully only in the 4th or present round. Up to this 4th life cycle, it is referred to as humanity only for lack of a more appropriate term. Like the grub which becomes chrysalis and butterfly, man, or rather that which becomes man, passes through all the forms and kingdoms during the first round, and through all the human shapes during the 2 following rounds. Arrived on our Earth at the commencement of the 4th, in the present series of life cycles and races, man is the first form that appears thereon, being preceded only by the mineral and vegetable kingdoms, even the latter having to develop and continue its further evolution through man. This will be explained in Volume 2. During the 3 rounds to come, humanity, like the globe on which it lives, will be ever tending to reassume its primeval form, that of a Dhyana host. Man tends to become a god and then God, like every other atom in the universe. Beginning so early as with the 2nd round, evolution proceeds already on quite a different plan. It is only during the 1st round that, heavenly, man becomes a human being on globe A, re-becomes a mineral, a plant, an animal, on globe B and C, etc. The process changes entirely from the 2nd round, but you have learned prudence, and I advise you to say nothing before the time for saying it has come. 5. Every life cycle on globe D, our Earth, is composed of 7 root races. They commence with the ethereal and end with the spiritual, on the double line of physical and moral evolution from the beginning of the terrestrial round to its close. One is a planetary round from globe A to globe G, the 7th, the other, the globe round or the terrestrial. This is very well described in esoteric Buddhism, and needs no further elucidation for the time being. 6. The first root race, i.e., the first men on earth, irrespective of form, were the progeny of the celestial men, rightly called in Indian philosophy the lunar ancestors or the Pitras, of which there are 7 classes or hierarchies. As all this will be sufficiently explained in the following sections and in Volume 2, no more need be said of it here. But the 2 works already mentioned, both of which treat of subjects from the occult doctrine, need particular notice. Esoteric Buddhism is too well known in theosophical circles, and even to the outside world, for it to be necessary to enter at length upon its merits here. It is an excellent book, and has done still more excellent work. But this does not alter the fact that it contains some mistaken notions, and that it has led many theosophists and lay readers to form an erroneous conception of the Eastern secret doctrine. Moreover, it seems, perhaps, a little too materialistic. Man, which came later, was an attempt to present the archaic doctrine from a more ideal standpoint, to translate some visions in and from the astral light, to render some teachings partly gathered from a master's thoughts, but unfortunately misunderstood. This work also speaks of the evolution of the early races of men on earth, and contains some excellent pages of a philosophical character. But so far it is only an interesting little mystical romance. It has failed in its mission, because the conditions required for a correct translation of these visions were not present. Hence the reader must not wonder if our volumes contradict these earlier descriptions in several particulars. Esoteric cosmogony in general, and the evolution of the human monad especially, differ so essentially in these 2 books, and in other theosophical works written independently by beginners, that it becomes impossible to proceed with the present work without special mention of these 2 earlier volumes, for both have a number of admirers, esoteric Buddhism especially. The time has arrived for the explanation of some matters in this direction. Mistakes have now to be checked by the original teachings and corrected. If one of the said works has too pronounced a bias toward materialistic science, the other is decidedly too idealistic, and at times is fantastic. From the doctrine rather incomprehensible to Western minds, which deals with the periodical obscurations and successive rounds of the globes along their circular chains, were born the first perplexities and misconceptions. One of such has reference to the 5th and even 6th rounders. Those who knew that a round was preceded and followed by a long pralaya, a pause of rest, which created an impassable gulf between 2 rounds until the time came for a renewed cycle of life, could not understand the fallacy of talking about 5th and 6th rounders in our 4th round. Gautama Buddha, it was held, was a 6th rounder. Plato and some other great philosophers and minds, 5th rounders. How could it be? One master taught and affirmed that there were such 5th rounders even now on earth, and though understood to say that mankind was yet in the 4th round, in another place he seemed to say that we were in the 5th. To this an apocalyptic answer was returned by another teacher. A few drops of rain do not make a monsoon, though they presage it. No, we are not in the 5th round, but 5th round men have been coming in for the last few thousand years. This was worse than the riddle of the Sphinx. Students of occultism subjected their brains to the wildest work of speculation. For a considerable time they tried to outvi Oedipus and reconcile the 2 statements. And as the masters kept as silent as the stony Sphinx herself, they were accused of inconsistency, contradiction and discrepancies. But they were simply allowing the speculations to go on in order to teach a lesson which the Western mind sorely needs. In their conceit and arrogance, and in their habit of materializing every metaphysical conception and term, without allowing any margin for Eastern metaphor and allegory, the Orientalists had made a jumble of the Hindu exoteric philosophy, and the Theosophists were now doing the same with regard to esoteric teachings. To this day it is evident that the latter have utterly failed to understand the meaning of the term fifth and sixth rounders. But it is simply this. Every round brings about a new development, and even an entire change, in the mental, psychic, spiritual and physical constitution of man, all these principles evolving on an ever-ascending scale. Hence it follows that those persons who, like Confucius and Plato, belonged psychically, mentally and spiritually to the higher planes of evolution, were in our fourth round, as the average man will be in the fifth round, whose mankind is destined to find itself, on this scale of evolution, immensely higher than is our present humanity. Similarly, Gautama Buddha wisdom incarnate was still higher and greater than all the men we have mentioned who are called fifth rounders, and so Buddha and Shankaracharya are termed sixth rounders allegorically. Hence again the concealed wisdom of the remark, pronounced at the time evasive: a few drops of rain do not make a monsoon, though they presage it. And now the truth of the following remark, in esoteric Buddhism, will be fully apparent. It is impossible, when the complicated facts of an entirely unfamiliar science are being presented to untrained minds for the first time, to put them forward with all their appropriate qualifications and abnormal developments. We must be content to take the broad rules first, and deal with the exceptions afterwards, and especially is this the case with a study, in connection with which the traditional methods of teaching, generally followed, aim at impressing every fresh idea on the memory, by provoking the perplexity it at last relieves. As the author of the remark was himself, as he says, an untrained mind in occultism, his own inferences, and his better knowledge of modern astronomical speculations than of archaic doctrines, led him, quite naturally and unconsciously to himself, to commit a few mistakes of detail, rather than of any broad rule. One such will now be noticed. It is a trifling one, still it is calculated to lead many a beginner into erroneous conceptions. But as the mistaken notions of the earlier editions were corrected in the annotations of the fifth edition, so the sixth may be revised and perfected. There were several reasons for such mistakes. They were due to the necessity, under which the teachers labored, of giving what were considered as evasive answers, the questions being too persistently pressed to be left unnoticed, while, on the other hand, they could only be partially answered. This position notwithstanding, the confession that half a loaf is better than no bread was but too often misunderstood and hardly appreciated as it ought to have been. As a result thereof, gratuitous speculations were sometimes indulged in by the European Lachelas. Among such were the mystery of the eighth sphere in its relation to the moon, and the erroneous statement that two of the superior globes of the terrestrial chain were two of our well-known planets. Besides the Earth, there are only two other worlds of our chain, which are visible: Mars and Mercury. This was a great mistake. But the blame for it is to be attached as much to the vagueness and incompleteness of the master's answer as to the question of the learner itself, which was equally vague and indefinite. It was asked, what planets, of those known to ordinary science, besides Mercury, belong to our system of worlds? Now if by system of worlds or terrestrial chain, or string was intended, in the mind of the querist, instead of the solar system of worlds as it should have been, then of course the answer was likely to have been misunderstood. For the reply was Mars, etc. and 4 other planets of which astronomy knows nothing. Neither A, B, nor Y, Z are known, nor can they be seen through physical means, however perfected. This is plain. A. Astronomy as yet knows nothing in reality of the planets, neither the ancient ones, nor those discovered in modern times. B. No companion planets from A to Z, i.e. no upper globes of any chain in the solar system, can be seen, with the exception of course of all the planets which come forth in number, as are Earth, the Moon, etc., etc. As to Mars, Mercury, and the 4 other planets, they bear a relation to Earth of which no master or high occultist will ever speak, much less explain the nature. In this same letter the impossibility is distinctly stated by one of the teachers to the author of Esoteric Buddhism. Try to understand that you are putting me questions pertaining to the highest initiation, that I can give you only a general view, but that I dare not, nor will I, enter into details. Copies of all the letters ever received or sent, with the exception of a few private ones in which there was no teaching the master says, are with the writer. As it was her duty, in the beginning, to answer and explain certain points not touched upon, it is more than likely that, notwithstanding the many annotations on these copies, the writer, in her ignorance of English and her fear of saying too much, may have bungled the information given. She takes the whole blame for it upon herself in any and every case. But it is impossible for her to allow students to remain any longer under erroneous impressions, or to believe that the fault lies with the esoteric system. Let it then be now distinctly stated that the theory broached is impossible, with or without the additional evidence furnished by modern astronomy. Physical science can supply corroborative, though still very uncertain, evidence, but only as regards heavenly bodies on the same plane of materiality as our objective universe. Mars and Mercury, Venus and Jupiter, like every hitherto discovered planet, or those still to be discovered, are all, per se, the representatives on our plane of such chains. As distinctly stated in one of the numerous letters of Mr. Sinnott's teacher, there are other and innumerable manvantaric chains of globes which bear intelligent beings, both in and outside our solar system. But neither Mars nor Mercury belong to our chain. They are, along with other planets, septenary units in the great host of chains of our system, and all are as visible as their upper globes are invisible. If it is still argued that certain expressions in the teacher's letters were liable to mislead, the answer comes, Amen, so they were. The author of Esoteric Buddhism understood it well when he wrote that such are the traditional modes of teaching, by provoking the perplexity they do or do not relieve as the case may be. At all events, if it is urged that this might have been explained earlier, and the true nature of the planets given out as they now are, the answer comes that it was not found expedient to do so at the time, as it would have opened the way to a series of additional questions, which could never be answered on account of their esoteric nature, and thus would only become embarrassing. It had been declared from the first, and has been repeatedly asserted since. 1. That no theosophist, not even as an accepted chela, let alone lay students, could expect to have the secret teachings explained to him thoroughly and completely, before he had irretrievably pledged himself to the brotherhood and passed through at least one initiation, because no figures and numbers could be given to the public. For figures and numbers are the key to the esoteric system. 2. That what was revealed was merely the esoteric lining of that which is contained in almost all the exoteric scriptures of the world, religions preeminently in the Brahmanas and the Upanishads of the Vedas, and even in the Puranas. It was a small portion of what is divulged far more fully now in the present volumes, and even this is very incomplete and fragmentary. When the present work was commenced, the writer, feeling sure that the speculation about Mars and Mercury was a mistake, applied to the teachers by letter for an explanation and an authoritative version. Both came in due time, and verbatim extracts from these are now given. It is quite correct that Mars is in a state of obscuration at present, and Mercury just beginning to get out of it. You might add that Venus is in her last round. If neither Mercury nor Venus have satellites, it is because of the reasons and also because Mars has 2 satellites to which he has no right. Phobos, the supposed inner satellite, is no satellite at all. Thus, this remark of long ago by Laplace and now by Fay do not agree, you see. Read Comte's Rendus Tome XC, page 569. Phobos keeps a too short periodic time, and therefore there must exist some defect in the mother idea of the theory, as Fay justly observes. Again, both Mars and Mercury are septenary chains, as independent of the Earth's sidereal lords and superiors as you are independent of the principles of Domling Tom Thumb, which were perhaps his 6 brothers, with or without nightcap. Gratification of curiosity is the end of knowledge for some men was said by Bacon, who was as right in postulating this truism as those who were familiar with it before him were right in hedging off wisdom from knowledge and tracing limits to that which is to be given out at one time. Remember? Knowledge dwells in heads replete with thoughts of other men. Wisdom and minds attentive to their own you can never impress it too profoundly on the minds of those to whom you impart some of the esoteric teachings. Here are more extracts from another letter written by the same authority. This time it is in answer to some objections laid before the teachers. They are based upon extremely scientific, and as futile, reasonings about the advisability of trying to reconcile the esoteric theories with the speculations of modern science, were written by a young theosophist as a warning against a secret doctrine, and in reference to the same subject. He had declared that if there were such companion Earths, they must be only a wee bit less material than our globe. How then was it that they could not be seen? The answer was, were psychic and spiritual teachings more fully understood, it would become next to impossible to even imagine such an incongruity. Unless less trouble is taken to reconcile the irreconcilable, that is to say, the metaphysical and spiritual sciences with physical or natural philosophy, natural being a synonym to the men of science of that matter which falls under the perception of their corporeal senses, no progress can be really achieved. Our globe, as taught from the first, is at the bottom of the arc of descent, where the matter of our perceptions exhibits itself in its grossest form. Hence it only stands to reason that the globes which overshadow our Earth must be on different and superior planes. In short, as globes, they are in cognition, but not in consubstantiality with our Earth, and thus pertain to quite another state of consciousness. Our planet, like all those we see, is adapted to the peculiar state of its human stock, That state which enables us to see with our naked eye the sidereal bodies which are coessential with our terrene plane and substance, just as their respective inhabitants, the Jovians, Martians and others, can perceive our little world, because our planes of consciousness, differing as they do in degree, but being the same in kind, are on the same layer of differentiated matter. What I wrote was, the minor pralaya concerns only our little strings of globes. We called chains strings in those days of lip confusion. To such a string our Earth belongs. This ought to have shown plainly that the other planets were also strings or chains. If he, meaning the objector, would perceive even the dim silhouette of one of such planets on the higher planes, he has to first throw off even the thin clouds of the astral matter that stand between him and the next plane. It thus becomes patent why we could not perceive, even with the help of the best telescopes, that which is outside our world of matter. Those alone, whom we call adepts, who know how to direct their mental vision and to transfer their consciousness, both physical and psychic, to other planes of being, are able to speak with authority on such subjects. And they tell us plainly, lead the life necessary for the acquisition of such knowledge and powers, and wisdom will come to you naturally. Whenever you are able to attune your consciousness to any of the 7 chords of universal consciousness, those chords that run along the sounding board of cosmos, vibrating from one eternity to another, when you have studied thoroughly the music of the spheres, then only will you become quite free to share your knowledge with those with whom it is safe to do so. Meanwhile, be prudent. Do not give out the great truths that are the inheritance of the future races to our present generation. Do not attempt to unveil the secret of being and non-being to those unable to see the hidden meaning of Apollo's heptachord, the lyre of the radiant God, in each of the 7 strings of which dwelleth the spirit, soul and astral body of the cosmos, whose shell only has now fallen into the hands of modern science. Be prudent, we say, prudent and wise, and above all take care what those who learn from you believe in, lest by deceiving themselves they deceive others, for such is the fate of every truth with which men are, as yet, unfamiliar. Let rather the planetary chains and other super and sub-cosmic mysteries remain a dreamland for those who can neither see nor yet believe that others can. It is to be regretted that few of us have followed the wise advice, and that many a priceless pearl, many a jewel of wisdom, has been cast to an enemy, unable to understand its value, who has turned round and rent us. Let us imagine, wrote the same master to his 2 late chelas, as he called the author of esoteric Buddhism, and another gentleman, his co-student for some time. Let us imagine that our Earth is one of a group of 7 planets or man-bearing worlds. The 7 planets are the sacred planets of antiquity, and are all septenary. Now the life impulse reaches A, or rather that which is destined to become A, and which so far is but cosmic dust, a laya center in these early letters, in which terms had to be invented and words coined. The rings very often became rounds and the rounds life cycles, and vice versa. To a correspondent who called a round a world ring, the teacher wrote, I believe this will lead to a further confusion. Around we are agreed to call the passage of a monad from globe A to globe G or Z. The world ring is correct. Advise Mr. Strongly to agree upon a nomenclature before going any further. Notwithstanding this agreement, many mistakes, owing to this confusion, crept into the earliest teachings. The races even were occasionally mixed up with the rounds and rings, and led to similar mistakes in man. Fragments of forgotten truth. From the first the Master had written, not being permitted to give you the whole truth, or divulge the number of isolated fractions, I am unable to satisfy you. This in answer to the questions. If we are right, then the total existence prior to the man period is 637. To all the queries relating to figures, the reply was, try to solve the problem of 777 incarnations, though I am obliged to withhold information, yet if you should work out the problem by yourself, it will be my duty to tell you so. But it never was so worked out, and the results were never ceasing perplexity and mistakes. Even the teaching about the septenary constitution of the sidereal bodies and of the macrocosm, from which the septenary division of the microcosm, or man, has until now been among the most esoteric. In olden times it used to be divulged only at initiation, together with the most sacred figures of the cycles. Now, as stated in one of the theosophical journals, the revelation of the whole system of cosmogony had not been contemplated, nor even thought for one moment possible, at a time when a few scraps of information were sparingly given out, in answer to letters written by the author of Esoteric Buddhism, in which he put forward a multiplicity of questions. Among these were questions on such problems as no master, however high and independent he might be, would have the right to answer, and thus divulge to the world the most time-honored and archaic of the mysteries of the ancient college temples. Hence only a few of the doctrines were revealed in their broad outlines, while details were constantly withheld, and all the efforts made to elicit more information about them were systematically eluded from the beginning. This was perfectly natural. Of the 4 Vidyas, out of the 7 branches of knowledge mentioned in the Puranas, namely Yajna Vidya, the performance of religious rites in order to produce certain results, Mahavidya, the great magic knowledge, now degenerated into Tantrika worship, Guhya Vidya, the science of mantras and their true rhythm or chanting, of mystical incantations, etc. Atma Vidya, or the true spiritual and divine wisdom, it is only the last which can throw final and absolute light upon the teachings of the 3 first named. Without the help of Atma Vidya, the other 3 remain no better than surface sciences, geometrical magnitudes having length and breadth, but no thickness. They are like the soul, limbs and mind of a sleeping man, capable of mechanical motions, of chaotic dreams and even sleepwalking, of producing visible effects, but stimulated only by instinctual, not intellectual causes, least of all by fully conscious spiritual impulses. A good deal can be given out and explained from the 3 first named sciences. But unless the key to their teachings is furnished by Atma Vidya, they will remain forever like the fragments of a mangled textbook, like the adumbrations of great truths, dimly perceived by the most spiritual, but distorted out of all proportion by those who would nail every shadow to the wall. Then, again, another great perplexity was created in the minds of students by the incomplete exposition of the doctrine of the evolution of the monads. To be fully realized, both this process and that of the birth of the globes must be examined far more from their metaphysical aspect than from what one might call a statistical standpoint, involving figures and numbers which are rarely permitted to be widely used. Unfortunately, there are few who are inclined to handle these doctrines only metaphysically. Even the best of the Western writers upon our doctrine declares in his work, when speaking of the evolution of the monads, that on pure metaphysics of that sort we are not now engaged. And in such case, as the teacher remarks in a letter to him, Why this preaching of our doctrines, all this uphill work and swimming in adversum flumen? Why should the West learn from the East? That which can never meet the requirements of the special tastes of the aesthetics? And he draws his correspondent's attention to the formidable difficulties encountered by us the adepts in every attempt we make to explain our metaphysics to the Western mind. And well he may, for outside of metaphysics, no occult philosophy, no esotericism is possible. It is like trying to explain the aspirations and affections, love and hatred, the most private and sacred workings in the soul and mind of a living man, by an anatomical description of the thorax and brain of his dead body. Let us now examine two tenets mentioned above, but hardly alluded to in esoteric Buddhism, and supplement them as far as lies in our power. Additional facts and explanations concerning the globes and the monads. Two statements made in the above work must be noticed, and the author's opinions quoted. The first is as follows. The spiritual monads do not fully complete their mineral existence on globe A, then complete it on globe B, and so on. They pass several times round the whole circle as minerals, and then again several times round as vegetables, and several times as animals. We purposely refrain for the present from going into figures. That was a wise course to adopt in view of the great secrecy maintained with regard to figures and numbers. This reticence is now partially relinquished, but it would perhaps have been better had the real numbers concerning rounds and evolutional gyrations been either entirely divulged at the time or entirely withheld. Mr. Sinnett understood this difficulty well when saying, "For reasons which are not easy for the outsider to divine, the possessors of occult knowledge are especially reluctant to give out numerical facts relating to cosmogony, though it is hard for the uninitiated to understand why they should be withheld. That there were such reasons is evident. Nevertheless, it is to this reticence that most of the confused ideas of some Eastern as well as Western pupils are due. The difficulties in the way of the acceptance of the particular tenets under consideration seemed great, just because of the absence of any data to go upon. But there it was. For, as the masters have many times declared, the figures belonging to the occult calculations cannot be given outside the circle of pledged chelas, and not even these can break the rules. To make things plainer, without touching upon the mathematical aspects of the doctrine, the teaching given may be expanded, and some obscure points solved. As the evolution of the globes and that of the monads are so closely interblended, we will make of the two teachings one. In reference to the monads, the reader is asked to bear in mind that Eastern philosophy rejects the Western theological dogma of a newly created soul for every baby born, a dogma as unphilosophical as it is impossible in the economy of nature. There must be a limited number of monads, evolving and growing more and more perfect, through their assimilation of many successive personalities, in every new manvantara. This is absolutely necessary in view of the doctrines of rebirth and karma, and of the gradual return of the human monad to its source absolute deity. Thus, although the hosts of more or less progressed monads are almost incalculable, they are still finite, as is everything in this universe of differentiation and finiteness. As shown in the double diagram of the human principles and the ascending globes of the world chains, there is an eternal concatenation of causes and effects, and a perfect analogy which runs through, and links together, all the lines of evolution. One begets the other globes as personalities. But, let us begin at the beginning. The general outline of the process by which the successive planetary chains are formed has just been given. To prevent future misconceptions, some further details may be offered which will also throw light on the history of humanity on our own chain, the progeny of that of the Moon. In the accompanying diagram, Fig. 1 represents the lunar chain of 7 globes at the outset of its 7th or last round, while Fig. 2 represents the Earth chain which will be, but is not yet in existence. The 7 globes of each chain are distinguished in their cyclic order by the letters A to G, the globes of the Earth chain being further marked by a cross, the symbol of the Earth. Now, it must be remembered that the monads cycling round any septenary chain are divided into 7 classes or hierarchies, according to their respective stages of evolution, consciousness and merit. Let us follow, then, the order of their appearance on globe A in the first round. The time spaces between the appearances of these hierarchies are in any one globe or so adjusted that when Class 7, the last, appears on Globe A, Class 1, the first, has just passed on to Globe B, and so on, step by step, all round the chain. Again, in the 7th round of the lunar chain, when Class 7, the last, quits Globe A, that globe, instead of falling asleep, as it had done in previous rounds, begins to die, to go into its planetary pralaya, and in dying it transfers successively, as just said, its principles, or life elements and energy, one after the other, to a new Laya center, which commences the formation of Globe A of the Earth chain. A similar process takes place for each of the globes of the lunar chain, one after the other, each forming a fresh globe of the Earth chain. Our Moon was the 4th globe of the series, and was on the same plane of perception as our Earth. But Globe A of the lunar chain is not fully dead till the first monads of the first class have passed from Globe G or Z, the last of the lunar chain, into the nirvana which awaits them between the 2 chains, and similarly for all the other globes as stated, each giving birth to the corresponding globe of the Earth chain. Further, when Globe A of the new chain is ready, the first class or hierarchy of monads from the lunar chain incarnate upon it in the lowest kingdom, and so on successively. The result of this is that it is only the first class of monads which attains the human state of development during the first round, since the second class, on each globe, arriving later, has not time to reach that stage. Thus the monads of Class 2 reach the incipient human stage only in the second round, and so on up to the middle of the 4th round. But at this point and on this 4th round in which the human stage will be fully developed, the door into the human kingdom closes, and henceforward the number of human monads, i.e., monads in the human stage of development, is complete. For the monads which had not reached the human stage by this point will, owing to the evolution of humanity itself, find themselves so far behind that they will reach the human stage only at the close of the 7th and last round. They will, therefore, not be men on this chain, but will form the humanity of a future Manvantara, and be rewarded by becoming men on a higher chain altogether, thus receiving their karmic compensation. To this there is but one solitary exception, and for very good reasons, of which we shall speak farther on. But this accounts for the difference in the races. It thus becomes apparent how perfect is the analogy between the processes of nature in the cosmos and in the individual man. The latter lives through his life cycle and dies. His higher principles, corresponding in the development of a planetary chain to the cycling monads, pass into devachan, which corresponds to the nirvana and states of rest intervening between two chains. The man's lower principles are disintegrated in time and are used by nature again for the formation of new human principles, the same process also taking place in the disintegration and formation of worlds. Analogy is thus the surest guide to the comprehension of the occult teachings. This is one of the 7 mysteries of the moon, and it is now revealed. The 7 mysteries are called by the Japanese Yamabushis, the mystics of the Lao Tzu sect, and the ascetic monks of Kyoto, the Zenadu the 7 jewels. Only, the Japanese and the Chinese Buddhist ascetics and initiates are, if possible, even more reticent in giving out their knowledge than are the Hindus. But the reader must not be allowed to lose sight of the monads, and must be enlightened as to their nature, as far as permitted, without trespassing upon the highest mysteries, of which the writer does not in any way pretend to know the last or final word. The monadic host may be roughly divided into 3 great classes. 1. The most developed monads, the lunar gods or spirits called, in India, the Pitras, whose function it is to pass in the first round through the whole triple cycle of the mineral, vegetable and animal kingdoms, in their most ethereal, filmy, and rudimentary forms, in order to clothe themselves in and assimilate the nature of the newly formed chain. They are those who first reach the human form, if there can be any form in the realm of the almost subjective on globe A, in the first round. It is they, therefore, who lead and represent the human element during the second and third rounds, and finally evolve their shadows at the beginning of the fourth round for the second class, or those who come behind them. 2. Those monads that are the first to reach the human stage during the 3.5 rounds, and to become men. 3. The laggards, the monads which are retarded, and which will not reach, by reason of karmic impediments, the human stage of all during this cycle or round, save one exception which will be spoken of elsewhere, as already promised. We are forced to use above the misleading word men, and this is a clear proof of how little any European language is adapted to express these subtle distinctions. It stands to reason that these men did not resemble the men of today, either in form or nature. Why then, it may be asked, call them men at all? Because there is no other term, in any Western language, which approximately conveys the idea intended. The word men at least indicates that these beings were manus-thinking entities, however they differed in form and intellection from ourselves. But in reality they were, in respect of spirituality and intellection, rather gods than men. The same difficulty of language is met with in describing the stages through which the monad passes. Metaphysically speaking, it is of course an absurdity to talk of the development of a monad, or to say that it becomes man. But any attempt to preserve metaphysical accuracy of language, in the use of such a tongue as the English, would necessitate at least 3 extra volumes of this work, and would entail an amount of verbal repetition, which would be wearisome in the extreme. It stands to reason that a monad cannot either progress or develop, or even be affected by the changes of state it passes through. It is not of this world or plane, and may only be compared to an indestructible star of divine light and fire, thrown down onto our earth, as a plank of salvation for the personalities in which it indwells. It is for the latter to cling to it, and thus partaking of its divine nature, obtain immortality. Left to itself, the monad will cling to no one, but, like the plank, be drifted away to another incarnation by the unresting current of evolution. Now the evolution of the external form, or body, round the astral, is produced by the terrestrial forces, just as in the case of the lower kingdoms, but the evolution of the internal, or real, man is purely spiritual. It is now no more a passage of the impersonal monad through many and various forms of matter endowed at best with instinct and consciousness on quite a different plane as in the case of external evolution, but a journey of the pilgrim soul through various states of not only matter, but of self-consciousness and self-perception, or of perception from apperception. The monad emerges from its state of spiritual and intellectual unconsciousness, and, skipping the first two planes too near the absolute to permit of any correlation with anything on a lower plane, it gets directly into the plane of mentality. But there is no plane in the whole universe with a broader margin, or a wider field of action, in its almost endless gradations of perceptive and apperceptive qualities, than this plane, which has in its turn an appropriate smaller plane for every form from the mineral monad up to the time when that monad blossoms forth by evolution into the divine monad. But all the time it is still one and the same monad, differing only in its incarnations, throughout its ever-succeeding cycles of partial or total obscuration of spirit, or partial or total obscuration of matter, two polar antitheses, as it ascends into the realms of mental spirituality, or descends into the depths of materiality. To return to esoteric Buddhism. The second statement is with regard to the enormous period intervening between the mineral epoch, on globe, and the man epoch, the term man epoch being used because of the necessity of giving a name to that fourth kingdom which follows the animal, though in truth the man on globe, during the first round, is no man, but only his prototype, or dimensionless image, from the astral regions. The statement runs as follows. The full development of the mineral epoch on globe prepares the way for the vegetable development, and, as soon as this begins, the mineral life impulse overflows into globe B. Then, when the vegetable development on globe A is complete and the animal development begins, the vegetable life impulse overflows to globe B, and the mineral impulse passes on to globe C. Then finally comes the human life impulse on globe A. And so it goes on for 3 rounds, when it slackens, and finally stops at the threshold of our globe, in the 4th round, because the human period of the true physical meant to be, the 7th, is now reached. This is evident, for as said, there are processes of evolution which precede the mineral kingdom, and thus a wave of evolution, indeed several waves of evolution, precede the mineral wave in its progress round the spheres. And now we have to quote from another article, The Mineral Monad in 5 Years of Theosophy. There are 7 kingdoms. The first group comprises 3 degrees of elementals, or nascent centers of forces from the first stage of differentiation of from mulaprakriti, or rather pradhana, primordial homogeneous matter, to its 3rd degree, i.e. from full unconsciousness to semi-perception. The second or higher group embraces the kingdoms from vegetable to man, the mineral kingdom, thus forming the central or turning point in the degrees of the monadic essence, considered as an evolving energy. 3 stages sub-physical on the elemental side, the mineral kingdom, 3 stages on the objective physical side. These are the first or preliminary 7 links of the evolutionary chain. Preliminary because they are preparatory, and though belonging in fact to the natural, they would be more correctly described as the sub-natural evolution. This process makes a halt in its stages at the third, at the threshold of the fourth stage, when it becomes, on the plane of natural evolution, the first really manward stage, thus forming with the three elemental kingdoms, the 10, the Sephirithal number. It is at this point that begins a descent of spirit into matter equivalent to an ascent in physical evolution, a reascent from the deepest depths of materiality, the mineral, towards its status quo ante, with a corresponding dissipation of concrete organism up to nirvana, the vanishing point of differentiated matter. Therefore it becomes evident why that which is pertinently called in esoteric Buddhism wave of evolution and mineral, vegetable, animal and man impulse stops at the door of our globe, at its fourth cycle or round. It is at this point that the cosmic monad, buddhi, will be wedded to, and become the vehicle of, the atmic ray, i.e. buddhi will awaken to an apperception of it, Atman, and thus enter on the first step of a new septenary ladder of evolution, which will lead it eventually to the 10th, counting from the lowest upwards, of the Sephirithal tree, the crown. Everything in the universe follows analogy. As above, so below, man is the microcosm of the universe. That which takes place on the spiritual plane repeats itself on the cosmic plane. Concretion follows the lines of abstraction, corresponding to the highest must be the lowest, the material to the spiritual. Thus, corresponding to the Sephirithal crown, or upper triad, there are the three elemental kingdoms, which precede the mineral, and which, using the language of the Kabbalists, answer in the cosmic differentiation to the worlds of form and matter, from the super-spiritual to the archetypal. Now what is a monad? And what relation does it bear to an atom? The following reply is based upon the explanations given in answer to these questions in the above-cited article, The Mineral Monad, written by the author. To the second question it is answered: none whatever to the atom or molecule as at present existing in the scientific conception. It can neither be compared with the microscopic organisms, once classed among polygastric infusoria, and now regarded as vegetable, and classed among algae, nor is it quite the monas of the peripatetics. Physically or constitutionally the mineral monad differs, of course, from the human monad, which is not physical, nor can its constitution be rendered by chemical symbols and elements. In short, as the spiritual monad is one, universal, boundless and impartite, whose rays, nevertheless, form what we, in our ignorance, call the individual monads of men, so the mineral monad being at the opposite curve of the circle is also one, and from it proceed the countless physical atoms, which science is beginning to regard as individualized. Otherwise, how could one account for and explain mathematically the evolutionary and spiral progress of the four kingdoms? The monad is the combination of the last two principles in man, the sixth and the seventh, and, properly speaking, the term human monad applies only to the dual soul, Atma Buddhi, not to its highest spiritual vivifying principle, Atma, alone. But since the spiritual soul, if divorced from the latter, Atma, could have no existence, no being, it has thus been called now the monadic, or rather cosmic, essence, if such a term be permitted, in the mineral, vegetable and animal, though the same throughout the series of cycles, from the lowest elemental up to the Deva kingdom, yet differs in the scale of progression. It would be very misleading to imagine a monad as a separate entity, trailing its slow way in a distinct path through the lower kingdoms, and after an incalculable series of transformations flowering into a human being. In short, that the monad of a Humboldt dates back to the monad of an atom of hornblende. Instead of saying a mineral monad, the more correct phraseology in physical science, which differentiates every atom, would of course have been to call it the monad manifesting in that form of prakriti called the mineral kingdom. The atom, as represented in the ordinary scientific hypothesis, is not a particle of something, animated by a psychic something, destined after eons to blossom into a man. But it is a concrete manifestation of the universal energy, which itself has not yet become individualized, a sequential manifestation of the one universal monas. The ocean of matter does not divide into its potential and constituent drops until the sweep of the life impulse reaches the evolutionary stage of man birth. The tendency towards segregation into individual monads is gradual, and in the higher animals comes almost to the point. The peripatetics applied the word monas to the whole cosmos in the pantheistic sense, and the occultists, while accepting this thought for convenience sake, distinguish the progressive stages of the evolution of the concrete from the abstract, by terms of which the mineral, vegetable, animal monad etc. are examples. The term merely means that the tidal wave of spiritual evolution is passing through that arc of its circuit. The monadic essence begins to imperceptibly differentiate towards individual consciousness in the vegetable kingdom. As the monads are uncompounded things, as correctly defined by Leibniz, it is the spiritual essence which vivifies them in their degrees of differentiation, which properly constitutes the monad, not the atomic aggregation, which is only the vehicle and the substance through which thrill the lower and the higher degrees of intelligence. Leibniz conceived of the monads as elementary and indestructible units, endowed with the power of giving and receiving with respect to other units, and thus of determining all spiritual and physical phenomena. It is he who invented the term apperception, which together with nerve, not perception, but rather sensation, expresses the state of the monadic consciousness through all the kingdoms up to man. Thus it may be wrong, on strictly metaphysical lines, to call Atma Buddhi a monad, since in the materialistic view it is dual and therefore compound. But as matter is spirit, and vice versa, and since the universe and the deity which informs it are unthinkable apart from each other, so in the case of Atma Buddhi. The latter being the vehicle of the former, Buddhi stands in the same relation to Atma as Adam Kadmon, the Kabbalistic Logos, does to Ein Sof, or Mulaprakriti to Parabrahman. And now a few words more on the moon. What, it may be asked, are the lunar monads just spoken of? The description of the 7 classes of Pitras will come later, but now some general explanations may be given. It must be plain to everyone that they are monads who, having ended their life cycle on the lunar chain, which is inferior to the terrestrial chain, have incarnated on the latter. But there are some further details which may be added, though they border too closely on forbidden ground to be treated of fully. The last word of the mystery is divulged only to adepts, but it may be stated that our satellite is only the gross body of its invisible principles. Seeing then that there are 7 earths, so there are 7 moons, the last alone being visible, the same for the sun, whose visible body is called a maya, a reflection, just as man's body is. The real sun and the real moon are as invisible as the real man, says an occult maxim. And it may be remarked, en passant, that those ancients were not so foolish after all who first started the idea of 7 moons. For though this conception is now taken solely as an astronomical measure of time, in a very materialized form, Yet underlying the husk there can still be recognized the traces of a profoundly philosophical idea. In reality, the moon is the satellite of the Earth in one respect only, viz. that physically the moon revolves round the Earth. But in every other respect, it is the Earth which is the satellite of the moon, and not vice versa. Startling as the statement may seem, it is not without confirmation from scientific knowledge. It is evidenced by the tides, by the cyclic changes in many forms of disease, which coincide with the lunar phases. It can be traced in the growth of plants, and is very marked in the phenomena of human conception and gestation. The importance of the moon and its influence on the earth were recognized in every ancient religion, notably the Jewish, and have been remarked by many observers of psychical and physical phenomena. But, so far as science knows, the Earth's action on the moon is confined to the physical attraction, which causes her to circle in her orbit. And should an objector insist that this fact alone is sufficient evidence that the moon is truly the Earth's satellite on other planes of action, one may reply by asking whether a mother, who walks round and round her child's cradle, keeping watch over the infant, is the subordinate of her child or dependent upon it. Though in one sense she is its satellite, yet she is certainly older and more fully developed than the child she watches. It is, then, the moon that plays the largest and most important part, as well in the formation of the earth itself, as in the peopling thereof with human beings. The lunar monads, or pitras, the ancestors of man, become in reality man himself. They are the monads who enter on the cycle of evolution on globe A, and who, passing round the chain of globes, evolved the human form, as has just been shown. At the beginning of the human stage of the fourth round on this globe, they ooze out their astral doubles from the ape-like forms which they had evolved in the third round. And it is this subtle, finer form which serves as the model round which nature builds physical man. These monads, or divine sparks, are thus the lunar ancestors, the pitras themselves. For these lunar spirits have to become men in order that their monads may reach a higher plane of activity and self-consciousness, i.e., the plane of the Manasa Putras, those who endow the senseless shells, created and informed by the pitras, with mind in the latter part of the third root trace. In the same way, the monads, or egos, of the men of the seventh round of our earth, after our own globes A, B, C, D, etc., parting with their life energy, will have informed, and thereby called to life, other Laya centers, destined to live and act on a still higher plane of being. In the same way will the Terrene ancestors create those who will become their superiors. It now becomes plain that there exists in nature a triple evolutionary scheme for the formation of the three periodical upadhis, or rather three separate schemes of evolution, which in our system are inextricably interwoven and interblended at every point. These are the monadic, or spiritual, the intellectual, and the physical evolutions. These three are the finite aspects, or the reflections on the field of cosmic illusion, of Atma, the seventh, the one reality. 1. The monadic, as the name implies, is concerned with the growth and development into still higher phases of activity of the monads, in conjunction with 2. The intellectual, represented by the Manasa Dhyanis, the solar devas, or the Agnishvata Pitras, the givers of intelligence and consciousness to man, and 3. The physical, represented by the chayas of the lunar pitras, round which nature has concreted the present physical body. This body serves as the vehicle for the growth, to use a misleading word, and the transformations through manas, and owing to the accumulation of experiences of the finite into the infinite, of the transient into the eternal and absolute. Each of these three systems has its own laws and is ruled and guided by different sets of the highest dhyānas or logoi. Each is represented in the constitution of man, the microcosm of the great macrocosm, and it is the union of these three streams in him which makes him the complex being he now is. Nature, the physical evolutionary power, could never evolve intelligence unaided. She can only create senseless forms, as will be seen in our anthropogenesis. The lunar monads cannot progress, for they have not yet had sufficient touch with the forms created by nature to allow of their accumulating experiences through its means. It is the Manasa Dhyanas who fill up the gap, and they represent the evolutionary power of intelligence and mind, the link between spirit and matter in this round. Also, it must be borne in mind that the monads which enter upon the evolutionary cycle upon Globe in the first round are in very different stages of development. Hence the matter becomes somewhat complicated. Let us recapitulate. The most developed, the lunar monads, reach the human germ stage in the first round, become terrestrial, though very ethereal, human beings towards the end of the third round, remaining on the globe through the obscuration period, as the seed for future mankind in the fourth round, and thus become the pioneers of humanity at the beginning of this, the present fourth round. Others reach the human stage only during later rounds, i.e., in the second, third or first half of the fourth round. And finally the most retarded of all, i.e., those still occupying animal forms after the middle turning point of the fourth round will not become men at all during this Manvantara. They will reach to the verge of humanity only at the close of the seventh round, to be, in their turn, ushered into a new chain, after Pralaya, by older pioneers, the progenitors of humanity, or the seed humanity, Shishta, viz. The men who will be at the head of all at the end of these rounds. The student scarcely needs any further explanation on the part played by the fourth globe and the fourth round in the scheme of evolution. From the preceding diagrams, which are applicable, mutatis mutandis, to rounds, globes or races, it will be seen that the fourth member of a series occupies a unique position. Unlike the others, the fourth has no sister globe on the same plane as itself, and it thus forms the fulcrum of the balance represented by the whole chain. It is the sphere of final evolutionary adjustments, the world of the karmic scales, the hall of justice, where the balance is struck, which determines the future course of the monad during the remainder of its incarnations in the cycle. And therefore is it that, after the central turning point has been passed in the great cycle, i.e., after the middle point of the fourth race in the fourth round on our globe, no more monads can enter the human kingdom. The door is closed for this cycle, and the balance struck. For were it otherwise, had there been a new soul created for each of the countless milliards of human beings that have passed away, and had there been no reincarnation, it would become difficult indeed to provide room for the disembodied spirits, nor could the origin and cause of suffering ever be accounted for. It is the ignorance of the occult tenets and the enforcement of false conceptions under the guise of religious education which have created materialism and atheism as a protest against the asserted divine order of things. The only exceptions to the rule just stated are the dumb races whose monads are already within the human stage, in virtue of the fact that these animals are later than, and even half descended from, man, their last descendants being the anthropoid and other apes. These human presentments are in truth only the distorted copies of the early humanity. But this will receive full attention in the next volume. As the commentary, broadly rendered, says. 1. Every form on Earth, and every speck atom in space, strives in its efforts towards self-formation, to follow the model placed for it in the heavenly man. It's the atom's involution and evolution, its external and internal growth and development, have all one and the same object man, as the highest physical and ultimate form on this earth, the monad in its absolute totality, and awakened condition as the culmination of the divine incarnations on earth. 2. The Dionys Pitras are those who have evolved their Buddha doubles from themselves, which Rupa form has become the vehicle of monad's seventh and sixth principles that had completed their cycle of transmigration in the 3 preceding kalpas rounds. Then, they the astral doubles became the men of the first human race of the round. But they were not complete, and were senseless. This will be explained in the sequel. Meanwhile man, or rather his monad, has existed on earth from the very beginning of this round. But, up to our own 5th race, the external shapes which covered those divine astral doubles have changed and consolidated with every sub-race, the form and physical structure of the fauna changing at the same time, as they had to be adapted to the ever-changing conditions of life on this globe during the geological periods of its formative cycle. And thus will they go on changing with every root race and every chief sub-race, down to the last one of the 7th in this round. 3. The inner, now concealed, man, was then in the beginnings the external man. The progeny of the Dionys Pitras, he was the son like unto his father. Like the lotus, whose external shape assumes gradually the form of the model within itself, so did the form of man in the beginning evolve from within without. After the cycle in which man began to procreate his species after the fashion of the present animal kingdom, it became the reverse. The human fetus follows now in its transformations all the forms that the physical frame of man assumed throughout the 3 kalpas rounds, during the tentative efforts at plastic formation around the monad by senseless, because imperfect, matter in her blind wanderings. In the present age, the physical embryo is a plant, a reptile, an animal, before it finally becomes man, evolving within himself his own ethereal counterpart, in his turn. In the beginning it was that counterpart astral man which, being senseless, got entangled in the meshes of matter. But this man belongs to the 4th round. As shown, the monad had passed through, journeyed and been imprisoned in every transitional form, throughout every kingdom of nature, during the 3 preceding rounds. But the monad which becomes human is not the man. In this round, with the exception of the highest mammals after man, the anthropoids destined to die out in this our race, when their monads will be liberated and pass into the astral human forms, or the highest elementals, of the 6th and the 7th races, and then into the lowest human forms in the 5th round. No units of any of the kingdoms are animated any longer by monads destined to become human in their next stage, but only by the lower elementals of their respective realms. These elementals will become human monads, in their turn, only at the next great planetary Manvantara. And in fact the last human monad incarnated before the beginning of the 5th root race. Nature never repeats herself, therefore the anthropoids of our day have not existed at any time since the middle of the Miocene period, when, like all crossbreeds, they began to show a tendency, more and more marked as time went on, to return to the type of their first parent, the gigantic black and yellow Lemuro-Atlantean. To search for the missing link is useless. To the scientists of the closing sixth root trace, millions and millions of years hence, our modern races, or rather their fossils, will appear as those of small insignificant apes and extinct species of the genus Homo. Such anthropoids form an exception because they were not intended by nature, but are the direct product and creation of senseless man. The Hindus attribute a divine origin to the apes and monkeys because the men of the third race were gods from another plane who had become senseless mortals. This subject had already been touched upon and Isis unveiled 12 years ago, as plainly as was then possible. The reader is there referred to the Brahmins, if he would know the reason of the regard they have for the monkeys. The reader would perhaps learn were the Brahmin to judge him worthy of an explanation that the Hindu sees in the ape, but what Manu desired he should. The transformation of species most directly connected with that of the human family, a bastard branch, engrafted on their own stock, before the final perfection of the latter. He might learn, further, that in the eyes of the educated heathen the spiritual or inner man is one thing, and his terrestrial physical casket another. That physical nature, that great combination of correlations of physical forces, ever creeping on towards perfection, has to avail herself of the material at hand. She models and remodels as she proceeds, and, finishing her crowning work in man, presents him alone as a fit tabernacle for the overshadowing of the divine spirit. Moreover, a German scientific work is mentioned in a footnote on the same page. It says that a Hanoverian scientist has recently published a work entitled Über die Auflösung der Arten durch Naturliche Zuchtwahl, in which he shows, with great ingenuity, that Darwin was wholly mistaken in tracing man back to the ape. On the contrary, he maintains that it is the ape which is evolved from man. He shows that, in the beginning, mankind were, morally and physically, the types and prototypes of our present race and of our human dignity, by their beauty of form, regularity of feature, cranial development, nobility of sentiments, heroic impulses, and grandeur of ideal conceptions. This is a purely Brahmanic, Buddhistic and Kabbalistic doctrine. His book is copiously illustrated with diagrams, tables, etc. It asserts that the gradual debasement and degradation of man, morally and physically, can be readily traced throughout ethnological transformations down to our time. And, as one portion has already degenerated into apes, so the civilized man of the present day will at last, under the action of the inevitable law of necessity, be also succeeded by like descendants. If we may judge of the future by the actual present, it certainly does seem possible that so unspiritual and materialistic a race should end as simia, rather than as seraphs. But though the apes descend from man, it is certainly not the fact that the human monad, which has once reached the level of humanity, ever incarnates again in the form of an animal. The cycle of metempsychosis for the human monad is closed, for we are in the fourth round and the fifth root trace. The reader will have to bear in mind at any rate one who has made himself acquainted with esoteric Buddhism that the stanzas which follow in this volume and the next speak of the evolution in our fourth round only. The latter is the cycle of the turning point, after which matter, having reached its lowest depths, begins to strive onward and to become spiritualized, with every new race and with every fresh cycle. Therefore the student must take care not to see contradiction where there is none, for in esoteric Buddhism rounds are spoken of in general, while here only the fourth, or our present round, is meant. Then it was the work of formation, now it is that of reformation and evolutionary perfection. Finally, to close this digression and end various, but unavoidable, misconceptions, we must refer to a statement in esoteric Buddhism, which has produced a very fatal impression upon the minds of many theosophists. One unfortunate sentence, from the work just referred to, is constantly brought forward to prove the materialism of the doctrine. The author, referring to the progress of organisms on the globes, says that the mineral kingdom will no more develop the vegetable than the earth was able to develop man from the ape, till it received an impulse. Whether this sentence renders the thought of the author literally, or is simply, as we believe it is, a lapsus calami, may remain an open question. It is really with surprise that we have ascertained the fact that esoteric Buddhism was so little understood by some theosophists as to have led them into the belief that it thoroughly supported Darwinian evolution, and especially the theory of the descent of man from a pithecoid ancestor. As one member writes, I suppose you realize that 3/4 of theosophists and even outsiders imagine that, as far as the evolution of man is concerned, Darwinism and theosophy kiss one another. Nothing of the kind was ever realized, nor is there any great warrant for it, so far as we know, in esoteric Buddhism. It has been repeatedly stated that evolution as taught by Manu and Kapila was the groundwork of the modern teachings, but neither occultism nor theosophy has ever supported the wild theories of the present Darwinists, least of all the descent of man from an ape. Of this, more hereafter. But one has only to turn to page 47 of the work named to find the statement that man belongs to a kingdom distinctly separate from that of the animals. With such a plain and unequivocal statement before him, it is very strange that any careful student should have been so misled, unless he is prepared to charge the author with a gross contradiction. Every round repeats the evolutionary work of the preceding round, on a higher scale. With the exception of some higher anthropoids, as just mentioned, the monadic inflow, or inner evolution, is at an end till the next Manvantara. It can never be too often repeated that the full-blown human monads have to be first disposed of before the new crop of candidates appears on this globe at the beginning of the next cycle. Thus there is a lull, and this is why, during the fourth round, man appears on Earth earlier than any animal creation, as will be described. But it is still urged that the author of esoteric Buddhism has preached Darwinism all along. Certain passages would undoubtedly seem to lend countenance to this inference. Besides which, the occultists themselves are ready to concede partial correctness to the Darwinian hypothesis, in later details, by laws of evolution, and after the midway point of the fourth race. Of that which has taken place, physical science can really know nothing, for such matters lie entirely outside of its sphere of investigation. But what the occultists have never admitted, nor will they ever admit, is that man was an ape in this or any other round, or that he ever could be one, however much he may have been ape-like. This is vouched for by the very authority from whom the author of esoteric Buddhism got his information. Thus, to those who confront the occultists with these lines from the above-named volume, it is enough to show that we may as reasonably and that we must, if we would talk about these matters at all, conceive a life impulse giving birth to mineral forms, as of the same sort of impulse concerned to raise a race of apes into a race of rudimentary men. To those who bring this passage forward as showing decided Darwinism, the occultists answer by pointing to the explanation of the master, Mr. Sinnett's teacher, which would contradict these lines, were they written in the spirit attributed to them. A copy of this letter was sent to the writer, together with others, 2 years ago, 1886, with additional marginal remarks, to quote from, in The Secret Doctrine. It begins by considering the difficulty experienced by the Western student in reconciling some facts previously given with the evolution of man from the animal, i.e., from the mineral, vegetable and animal kingdoms, and advises the student to hold to the doctrine of analogy and correspondences. Then it touches upon the mystery of the devas and even gods having to pass through states, which it was agreed to refer to as immortalization, inherbation, inzunization, and finally incarnation, and explains this by hinting at the necessity of failures, even in the ethereal races of Dayan Chohans. Concerning this it says, "These failures are too far progressed and spiritualized to be thrown back forcibly from Dayan Chohanship into the vortex of a new primordial evolution through the lower kingdoms." After which, a hint only is given about the mystery contained in the allegory of the fallen Asuras, which will be expanded and explained in Volume 2. When karma has reached them at the stage of human evolution, they will have to drink it to the last drop in the bitter cup of retribution. Then they become an active force and commingle with the elementals, the progressed entities of the pure animal kingdom, to develop little by little the full type of humanity. These Dayan Chohans, as we see, do not pass through the three kingdoms as do the lower Pitras, nor do they incarnate in man until the third root race. Thus, as the teaching stands, round I man in the first round and first race on globe D, our earth, was an ethereal being, a lunar Dhyani, as man, non-intelligent but super-spiritual, and correspondingly, on the law of analogy, in the first race of the fourth round. In each of the subsequent races and sub-races, he grows more and more into an encased or incarnate being, but still preponderatingly ethereal. He is sexless and, like the animal and vegetable, he develops monstrous bodies correspondential with his coarser surroundings. Round 2. He-Man is still gigantic and ethereal, but growing firmer and more condensed in body. A more physical man yet still less intelligent and spiritual. 1. For mind is a slower and more difficult evolution than is the physical frame. Round 3. He has now a perfectly concrete or compacted body, at first the form of a giant ape, and now more intelligent, or rather cunning, than spiritual. 4. On the downward arc, he has now reached a point where his primordial spirituality is eclipsed and overshadowed by nascent mentality. 2. In the last half of the third round, his gigantic stature decreases, and his body improves in texture, and he becomes a more rational being, though still more an ape than a deva. All this is almost exactly repeated in the third root race of the fourth round. Round IV. Intellect has an enormous development in this round. The hitherto dumb races acquire our present human speech on this globe, on which, from the fourth race, language is perfected and knowledge increases. At this halfway point of the fourth round as of the fourth, or Atlantean, root race, humanity passes the axial point of the minor manvantaric cycle, the world teeming with the results of intellectual activity and spiritual decrease. This is from the authentic letter. What follows are the later remarks and additional explanations traced by the same hand in the form of footnotes. 1. The original letter contained general teaching, a bird's eye view, and particularized nothing. To speak of physical man while limiting the statement to the early rounds would be drifting back to the miraculous and instantaneous coats of skin. The first nature, the first body, the first mind on the first plane of perception, on the first globe in the first round, is what was meant. For karma and evolution have centered in or make such strange extremes, from different natures marvelously mixed to restore. He has now reached the point by analogy, and as the third root race in the fourth round, where the angel man's primordial spirituality is eclipsed and overshadowed by nascent human mentality, and you have the true version on your thumbnail. These are the words of the teacher, text, words and sentences in brackets, and explanatory footnotes. It stands to reason that there must be an enormous difference in such terms as objectivity and subjectivity, materiality and spirituality, when the same terms are applied to different planes of being and perception. All this must be taken in its relative sense. And therefore there is little to be wondered at if, left to his own speculations, an author who, however eager to learn, was yet quite inexperienced in these abstruse teachings, has fallen into an error. Nor was the difference between the rounds and the races sufficiently defined in the letters received, since nothing of the kind had been required before, as the ordinary Eastern disciple would have found out the difference in a moment. Moreover, to quote from a letter of the Master, the teachings were imparted under protest. They were, so to say, smuggled goods, and when I remained face to face with only one correspondent, the other Mr. had so far tossed all the cards into confusion that little remained to be said without trespassing upon law. Theosophists whom it may concern will understand what is meant. The outcome of all this is that nothing had ever been said in the letters to warrant the assurance that the occult doctrine has ever taught, or any adept believed in, unless metaphorically, the preposterous modern theory of the descent of man from a common ancestor with the ape and anthropoid of the actual animal kind. To this day the world is more full of ape-like men than the woods are of men like apes. The ape is sacred in India because its origin is well known to the initiates, though concealed under a thick veil of allegory. Hanyamana is the son of Pavana, Vayu, god of the wind, by Anjana, wife of a monster called Kasari, though his genealogy varies. The reader who bears this in mind will find in Volume 2, Passam, the whole explanation of this ingenious allegory. The men of the third race, who separated, were gods by their spirituality and purity, though senseless, and as yet destitute of mind, as men. These men of the third race, the ancestors of the Atlanteans, were just such ape-like, intellectually senseless giants as were those beings who, during the third round, represented humanity. Morally irresponsible, it was these third-race men who, through promiscuous connection with animal species lower than themselves, created that missing link which became ages later, in the tertiary period only, the remote ancestor of the real ape, as we find it now in the pithecoid family. And if this is found clashing with the statement which shows the animal later than man, then the reader is asked to bear in mind that the placental mammal only is meant. In those days, there were animals of which zoology does not even dream in our own, and the modes of reproduction were not identical with the notions which modern physiology has upon the subject. It is not altogether convenient to touch upon such questions in public, but there is no contradiction or impossibility in this whatever. Thus the earlier teachings, however unsatisfactory, vague and fragmentary, did not teach the evolution of man from the ape. Nor does the author of esoteric Buddhism assert it anywhere in his work in so many words, but, owing to his inclination towards modern science, he uses language which might perhaps justify such an inference. The man who preceded the fourth, the Atlantean, race, however much he may have looked physically like a gigantic ape, the counterfeit of man who hath not the life of a man, was still a thinking, and already a speaking man. The Lemuro-Atlantean was a highly civilized race, and if one accepts tradition, which is better history than the speculative fiction which now passes under that name, he was higher than we are with all our sciences and the degraded civilization of the day. At any rate, the Lemuro-Atlantean of the closing third race was so. And now we may return to the stanzas. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.